Right here, and Jill. Yeah. When you're okay. Here we go. So, welcome everybody. This is the Senate Democratic Caucus, but we're meeting together, Republicans and Democrats today, to get better educated in time for town meeting. And today we're going to be focused on school funding. We're going to first talk about key drivers of the challenges we face with school funding. We're then going to address school construction and those bond drivers on our taxes statewide and locally. And then we are going to talk, if we have time, about H-850, the quote unquote fix to our the challenges, the unintended consequences of Act 127. So we are lucky enough today to have great experts on these issues talking with us. We have, well, she's just right. We're going to start with Julia Richter of our own Joint Fiscal Office to talk about the key drivers to our education funding system this year in particular. So Julia, come on up. We have a handout for you, which is on the table. I'm just going to ask you to come, whoops, I'm sorry. Right up, if maybe you stand right there. Here's the microphone you need for the people on Zoom land.
It doesn't amplify.
It doesn't amplify, but you need it. And so your people will see you here, but we're all here. Okay. So you kind of have to keep it.
Okay, sounds great. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. I'm a senior fiscal analyst and I focus on education finance and the Ed Fund. I've been asked to come forward and give sort of a big picture overview, level setting in terms of what's going on in the Ed Fund. Why are people hearing that property taxes are forecasted to increase by 20%, and just some level setting for all of us here. So I did prep a handout. I probably won't be going through it. I believe it's on the table over there. And it sort of is broken out into the major questions I was asked to cover. Feel free to interrupt me with questions. I don't know how you normally do it, but I'm happy to be interrupted. So starting big picture, an overview of the education fund. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Ed Fund, Vermont's public K-12 education is financed by the Education Fund, which is a statewide fund that includes local spending decisions and local tax administration. So what does that mean? It means that it's a fund that's different than the other funds that we talk about in state government because the expenditures come first, and then revenues need to be raised to ensure that all of those expenditures can be fully funded. So that's where property taxes come in. The Ed Fund has other sources of revenue like sales and use, meals and rooms. But after accounting for those revenue sources, we then need to calculate property taxes in some manner in order to ensure that all expenditures that local voters have voted for on their school budgets, along with any statewide decisions, are fully funded. So there's two classes of properties that are taxed in Vermont. It's homestead and non-homestead. Homestead is pretty much, it has a long drawn out definition in statute, but it can be thought of as the primary dwelling, so where someone lives, and all of the surrounding acreage. These are the folks who pay on homestead or on property or on income. The income refers to is on the homestead property, the house site, and 2 acres. There's also the non-homestead property, which applies to all other properties in the state that are taxed. So that includes things like second homes and deer camps, but it also includes apartment buildings, businesses, parking lots. Any property that's taxed that's not a homestead is non-homestead. So that's like the 5 minutes. How does the Ed Fund work in Vermont? It's a very unique formula. So with that context, we get into I think the big question that I've been asked a lot, and maybe you all are being asked too, is why are property taxes forecasted to increase by 20% this year? And we need to start by thinking about the structure of the Ed Fund that we just walked through, which is that ultimately revenues need to be raised in order to ensure that expenditures are fully funded, right? So if expenses are going up, the money to fund those expenses needs to come from somewhere. So how much is education spending forecasted to increase? We see that that's the first question I've got here on the handout. AOE, the Agency of Education, asks school districts over the course of the session for the latest budget numbers. So these are the latest budget numbers I have available. And spending is forecasted to increase by almost 15% for FY25, the year we're coming into, that we're setting property tax rates for, compared to FY24, the prior year. This is about $243 million on top of what needed to be raised last year, solely on education spending. Why is spending forecasted to increase by so much? There's a lot of things driving that conversation. We could talk for a whole week here about that. But I cited a few that the tax commissioner cited in his December 1st letter on the handout here. You can see that federal funds dried up, those ESSER funds. And so a lot of school districts have included what those ESSER funds were funding now in their school budget. So now it's not federal dollars, but state dollars. Increase in healthcare and benefit costs of 16%, increasing inflation costs, which increases everything from operating, living, working, overall expenses, and debt service to new capital projects and renovations. It's not an exhaustive list, but those were some of the major reasons that the commissioner cited in his letter. So why are property taxes forecasted to increase? We spoke about this a bit when I started, but ultimately, property taxes need to make sure that the education fund is fully funded. So education expenditures are growing faster than non-property tax revenue sources flowing into the ed fund, right? So we see those lines going like that. Property taxes need to make up the difference. Assuming there's no other change in policy. Two more points. I prepared to talk about this. I am staying high level. I'm happy to talk in more detail about any of this as would be helpful. One of the other questions is, if property taxes increase, will this impact income sensitized property taxpayers? In short, yes. Income sensitized property are those folks who essentially pay on income. Those property tax credits are adjusted based on the local ed spending decisions and on everything else that's happening in the statewide education fund. So if someone is paying on property or paying on income, they're going to be seeing an increase in their property tax bill, assuming everything that we're talking about here holds true, right? That there's no other policy decisions that are made. I'm talking about a point in time right now, not what's going to happen, but what may happen given the current data. Lastly, is the common level of appraisal, or the CLA, the reason for the forecasted property tax increase? In short, no. What the CLA aims to do is to adjust property values across the state to ensure that all towns are paying their fair share into the statewide education fund. So while the CLA is adjusting a local tax rate in order to ensure that that community is paying its fair share, it's not making one town pay disproportionately into the statewide ed fund. I'll pause there. I don't know if you want to, how you want to go.
Anybody have a question at the moment?
Two simple questions. One is, what's the tax rate, homestead versus non-homestead? How do they compare? Just I've never heard a number.
Sure. So I guess I probably should have led with saying everything I'm talking about is holding all else equal, outstanding policy decisions, right? We're still, you're all still needing to set the rates for fiscal year 25. The non-homestead tax rate is a uniform tax rate across the state before the CLA is applied to it. In FY24, it was $1.391. And in fiscal year 25, it depends on all of the policy decisions that are decided in the upcoming 10 weeks or however long. The homestead is a little bit more complicated because it is adjusted based on local spending decisions and what's happening at the state level. We also have the income sensitivity portion of that. So some folks pay on property, some folks pay on income, some folks pay on property and receive a property tax credit for their income. But in fiscal year 25, the average rate across the state, and you'll keep in mind it does vary by district, in fiscal year 24, thank you, was $1.311.
And next question is the 243 million that was projected by AOE. Was that based on budget warnings? Or what was that?
Yes, it was based on the Warren budgets, the best available data that they had. It was collected prior to the House's passage of H.850, which, if there's time, the handout does have a few questions about that.
I'm hoping that number will come down. I know our school district has already revised their budget, so I know they're.
Julia?
Yeah, Brian.
Would you remind us how many Vermonters qualify for income sensitivity?
About 2/3 of Vermonters receive some form of income sensitivity, but you'll keep in mind that the property tax credit is dependent on the household income and the value of the homestead.
Right.
So the level of the property tax credit, and if they're paying fully on income, fully on property, or some combination of the two, is less than 2/3.
That's just 2/3 of residential property, it's not necessarily all Vermont.
Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, 2/3 of homestead property taxpayers receive some form of income sensitivity.
And just to finish on income sensitivity, there was a cap of 2.5% of income, but that is that in play? Is there still that cap?
I'm not sure the cap you're referring to.
When?
The 14.8% that you have early in, sorry.
A question about the 20% increase that we hear a lot. Is the 20% now changed to 14.8%, or are those two different numbers measuring different things?
Those are different numbers measuring different things, but connected. So the 14.8% is referring to the estimated, as of February 13th, the latest data I had available, estimated growth in education spending. That ed spending is a technical term we use in ed finance that doesn't actually mean all spending on education, but it's after we parse some things out of school budgets. So when thinking about pressures to the education fund, that technical increase in education spending, and the slower performance of non-property tax revenue sources, when combining all of those factors together, that's when we get to the current forecast of about 20%.
Okay, so the 20% still is accurate. And
Given, as of February 13th, and outstanding policy decisions.
okay, thank you. And then regarding homestead versus non-homestead, my understanding is that some towns homestead's higher, other towns non-homestead is higher.
So it does depend. I don't have the numbers in front of me in terms of how many towns have a higher homestead or non-homestead. When comparing the two, it's also important to keep in mind that because 2/3 of homestead payers receive some form of income sensitivity, just because the homestead rate is higher does not necessarily mean that the homestead bill is higher than the non-homestead bill on the same valued property, because there's those two components of the homestead property tax rate and income sensitivity.
Great, thank you.
So you're just gonna make a statement.
We have a couple people on Zoom. So
I think this points out in many ways the difference between working in the Senate chamber and the House chamber, because for all of us here, I believe, there are multiple school districts in our district, and they all will be affected in some way a little bit differently. So we have to sort of understand that when we decide on H.850, I think, where we are on that. My question, I guess, is, and it's probably too early for you to speculate, If this were not to pass H 850 and we left Act 127 in place, would that impact more districts negatively or positively? And the second part of that is, if H 850 does pass, as I expect it will, quite frankly, how will that affect districts in our school districts?
Sure, I can certainly speak to that. Should I get into H 850 now?
We were going to save it until after school construction, but that's a quick answer that you can more.
I think that there's a little bit of level setting, but I do think it's natural to move into it because it does get to it does really get to the heart of the question. So H 850, to level set, it's the bill that is currently in Senate Appropriations. It does a number of things. I've listed sort of the high level, what each section does. And one of those is the 5% cap that we're hearing about. So what is the 5% cap? Essentially, it was a transition provision that was created in Act 127, the pupil weighting bill, that made it so that a school district's tax rate before the CLA could not increase by more than 5%. However, with the latest budget data that came in, that we were just talking about, that 14.8% increase, when putting that budget data into the yield model, which is how we go about solving for property tax rates, we saw that every single school district in the state had a capped rate. So every school district hit that 5% cap, and no more money could be raised on homestead because of the circularity and complexity of the ed fund. So because every school district hit the 5% cap, that meant that one of the flexible levers that the General Assembly has in order to fill the education fund up was no longer flexible. And so all property taxes then needed to be raised on non-homestead after all school districts hit the cap. So in short,
the only thing I would say is to be very clear that means our businesses, what is non-homestead. Obviously, people think of second homes, but it would be rental property, and that would obviously impact rents. So just to be clear, it's not just, we tend to think of the second home or maybe the hunting camp, but actually the implications are would be very significant on Vermont businesses and on rental property.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, maybe someone's lucky enough that every school district in their senatorial district is going to be affected positively, then it's a pretty easy decision to make. But I have the feeling that that's not true, that there are winners and losers, as is true all too often in life. So I think that's what we're all grappling with.
Are you really, if there are any other questions, I think we'll pivot to Jill and Nicole.
Sure.
And then will you stay, and then we can ask questions of all three of them, if that works for everybody.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So now the other driver, and you mentioned this earlier, because all taxpayers pay for our bonded construction in some capacity. So Jill, where is Jill? Okay. Okay, Nicole Lee. Okay. We welcome Nicole Lee. I'm not sure everybody's met her yet. She is the new Brad James. And so we are thrilled to have you, and welcome aboard.
Thank you.
And you've jumped right into the frying pan. So remember, your audience is here. I think we have Keisha on, we have a couple senators on Zoom, and you have all of us here. So take it away.
So there will be a handout. It's just not quite ready yet, but it'll be exactly what I go over. So the funding of education in Vermont is a statewide responsibility, and that means that construction costs deemed legitimate education costs become part of that statewide responsibility, meaning all taxpayers help pay for any new school construction. The majority of the construction costs, principal and interest payments, fall directly on the district's homestead taxpayers. This is because the annual principal and interest payments will be part of the district's budget and education spending. That then drives up education spending per pupil in the district and the homestead tax rate, because the homestead tax rate is directly proportional to ed spending per pupil in a district. So if a district's spending increases, so will the same district's homestead tax rate, meaning the citizens of the district will be paying more homestead taxes into the ed fund. And while those increased taxes will cover the majority, they will not cover all of that construction cost. All other school districts in the state will also pay a portion of those costs. Presuming all other factors stay constant, so this all else equals, an increase in every other school district's homestead rate will occur because the education fund will require more money due to the district that is doing construction's annual principal and interest payments. So the ed spending per pupil of all other school districts, in my example, won't change. However, the tax rates will. Because if the tax rates did not change, then the ed fund wouldn't be fully funded. We, at any point, we make the districts whole via the ed fund. So it has to raise enough money. So that means that while everyone else's spending could be exactly the same, the yield will be impacted by the school construction, which will then impact every homestead taxpayer. So essentially the demand on the education fund is determined by what districts spend and what categorical grants they are owed. The non-property tax revenue is calculated and subtracted from the total. The remainder is the net amount to be raised by combined property taxes, homestead taxpayers who pay based on household income, and non-homestead property taxpayers. As the net amount of ed spending goes up, property taxes go up. So when all is said and done, all property taxpayers in Vermont will be paying for a portion of a district construction project. The resident homestead property owners of the district will be paying the larger share. Yes.
If someone bonds, so there are towns that are, oh, sorry, Allison. If there are towns that are bonding separate from this, so this is not, yes, but this is not included. So if you're bonding a bond, oh,
Yes,
it will,
the bond-
okay.
So the
these
bond
are,
principal and interest payment gets added into the education spending of the district, which then impacts the yield for everyone and more so the homestead tax rates for that district.
oh, okay. Wow, that explains a lot.
So
And we have, as a shorthand, we've said we have a moratorium on school construction. In one sense, that's true. In another sense, it's not, because the government doesn't step in and help with construction. Districts go it alone, and in a certain way that finds its way to all of our tax rates.
That's correct.
I would like to add something to this. Is one of the reasons why I think we need to restart the school construction aid in the great state of Vermont is because that will allow for the state, which sees all the districts, to prioritize which districts need the resources more based on their infrastructure. Right now, it's up to each of those individual districts and the willingness of those voters to approve those bonds. If the state can offer some additional guidance, looking at the state of all the condition of those facilities to subsidize or at least reduce the borrowing cost or the cost of capital for those loans, I see merit in allowing the state to play an active role in prioritizing those resources.
Great. And on that note, we're going to pivot to Jill Briggs Campbell.
I know.
Because she is going to pick up right where Thomas ended.
I'm glad we rehearsed that. That was well done. Beautifully done. Jill Briggs Campbell, Agency of Education, Director of Operations. I will project even louder. I see that.
And it's good wave.
And this way here. And I see that Senator Chittenden read our report. So thank you. Appreciate it. So I will take a step back and also talk about the state of the state in terms of school facilities and construction. So we just completed our first ever statewide facilities assessment. That work was completed in October, and the numbers are sobering. I don't have good news on this front. So we have the second oldest building stock in the nation. We have, since 2007, had a suspension of statewide construction aid, and we know that our school budgets chronically and consistently underfund maintenance and operations. So we know that a standard of 3% is standard for M&O budgets, and we know that our school budgets usually at best hover around 1.5% at best. So what our statewide facilities assessment revealed, and just stick a big asterisk next to this number because it is underreporting it, is something along the lines of $280 million of immediate health and safety needs or systems that are beyond their remaining useful life, which means they're one failure away from, one critical failure away from being non-operational. In addition, we're looking at something like $300 million per year for 20 years just to get us to an in-kind replacement of current systems. Yeah. Like I said, I have no good news on this front. So that is sort of the diagnosis of the patient. That's what the statewide facilities assessment revealed. This does not include modernizing systems. This does not include improving the delivery of education through modern school facilities. This is literally replacing a unit ventilator with a unit ventilator, which we would never ever do, right? Yeah.
That taken into consideration any new construction for PCBs?
No, it does not take into consideration PCBs. There's some shorthand estimates in there because the facilities assessment was rolling out at the same time the PCB school testing program was, which to date has not yielded a fully complete program. So we couldn't say at all what a PCB testing remediation project will cost. So we put some placeholders in there on some schools where we knew we had PCBs, but ballparks, right? Those are large ballparks. It also doesn't include other things that would be revealed in any kind of construction, right? The asbestos hiding behind the wall, the mold remediation that we know needs to happen in many schools, et cetera, et cetera. So faced with this really big hole and really an insurmountable hole in a small state with limited resources and competing priorities, last year, you all created the State School Construction Aid Task Force. That report was generated on February 1st. Myself and my colleague Bob Donahue have spent a lot of quality time in-house recently going over the recommendations, and Senator Chittenden actually did a beautiful job of summarizing, which was, in essence, the state, if they're going to engage in state construction aid, really needs to drive those limited dollars towards educational priorities that we have already identified. And the task force actually looked at existing statute as the place to begin. So looking at Act 60, Act 68, Act 127, there's two pieces in there. We talk about the equalized pupil weighting, but there's also district quality standards in there, which my team at AOE works on. We looked at Act 72 and facility standards. We looked at Act 67, community schools, Act 77, flexible pathways. So the state has already said, you all have already said what you prioritize most in education, which is equitable access to high quality educational opportunities, right? That's the lodestone. So therefore, limited state construction dollars should be driving towards projects that will serve those priorities. So that's sort of where we're at as of today. I don't think anybody is talking about this session restarting state construction aid and rolling out dollars that way. But the task force has made recommendations about some work that needs to be done ahead of time. So we have a really thoughtful, really thorough and comprehensive program before any potential future state dollars roll out. So you'll see House Ed has a bill being drafted right now. It's looking at joint fiscal office doing additional modeling. The state treasurer's office did some modeling around bonding, but there's many other ways to fund this. Other states have funded it in different ways. So looking at that, there's also the need for, the task force was made up of, I think, 17 members. And that's just challenging to try to really identify a full program. So there's a recommendation to identify a small working group that can really dig in and flesh out the recommendations of the task force or any other recommendations that you would like them to dig into. And then also there's a look at potentially doing something like a district level master planning grant for facilities. The idea being here that before state dollars would go towards a construction project, you would want the district to have a vision for where it was going. This is an acknowledgement, I'm going to sort of be frank about it, that we have 384 public school buildings. And that before, say, you invested in the full renovation of an existing elementary school, I'm going to fake example here, I have no specific school in mind, but before you got a request for $60 million for an elementary school, we would want the district to have had the conversation about the 4 elementary schools that are within 10 minutes of that school, right? So there is this recommendation coming from House to do some master planning grants, always kind of driving towards that equitable access to, capacity and technical expertise. So that is the current state of school construction and school facilities. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks. We have time for 2 questions because then I think we're going to pivot to 850 to H850 unless people felt that we had covered it adequately. I'm not sure we have. So questions for Jill or Nicole? Okay.
I think 850 is the more immediate need, so I'm happy to cede my time.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Great. Oh, here. Thank you for taking the time. So, Phil, what's your thought about who would like to take the lead in discussing 850? Anne and Jane? Brian? Who is wanting to? Yeah, she's not. Julia, are you able to? Jane? Mechanics. We'd love to have you.
Okay, hi, Julia Richter again. I will be happy to talk about the mechanics. Can't speak to the policy, of course. It's nonpartisan staff. So I put together some sort of high-level notes on the back of the handout, sort of like the summary notes from the fiscal note. So taking a step back, we've got Act 127 of 2022, the pupil weighting bill. We were just talking about this. It had the transition provision that we were speaking about that capped districts' rates at increases of no more than 5% before the CLA. This is the homestead property tax rate. So of course, with the homestead and non-homestead as the 2 flexible levers in the education fund, what we spoke about is that with the latest budget data, all homestead property tax rates of every district hit that 5% cap, which then meant that non-homestead was the only remaining flexible lever in the education fund with respect to property. Of course, there's other policy levers at your disposal, but when thinking about property taxes, those are the mechanics of how the 5% cap is working in the system, given the current budget data that we have available. So that's level setting where we were. And so what is H850? What does it do? So there are really sort of 4 high-level sections within H850. It would repeal this 5% transition mechanism that we were just speaking about. There was a corresponding 10% tax rate review board that is part of that provision that would also be repealed. It implements a new transition mechanism for fiscal years 25 through 29. This is being referred to as the cent discount. Essentially, big picture, analysis has been done looking at the change in tax capacity by district. So for every % decrease that a district saw in its change in tax capacity, it would receive a corresponding 1 cent discount to its homestead property tax rate before the CLA in fiscal year 25. And then it would phase out by 20% each year through FY 29. Correct, to homestead. So homestead, that varies by district. The homestead rate, non-homestead is uniform across the state. There's also a provision in there that says that the discount provision for folks who pay on income for their homestead property tax tax would see a proportional change to their income rate that corresponds with the cent discount that has been calculated for the homestead property tax rate. That would be calculated by the tax department. It's my understanding it would follow a similar calculation to what was done with the cent discounts after Act 46, the mergers from a few years ago. It would allow school districts to rewarn and or postpone budget votes, so they could go back, open their budgets back up, take things out, put things in, make changes to it. And it includes an appropriation of $500,000 from the general fund to help those districts that have decided to rewarn or postpone their budget votes. I spoke about the transition mechanism here. Essentially, it's that cent discount over 5 years. I guess those are the high-level mechanics, I would say, of H.850. I don't know if you want to open it up to questions, Senator.
Absolutely. I want to open it up to questions. So who has a question? And here you go.
Oh, sure. Okay. Just about, fair enough. Just about the mechanics of H 580. One of the 850. One of the things that I am not clear about is how, by removing the cap and putting in this discount mechanism, a lot of my districts are finding that their projected tax increases are actually going to go up. They're actually worse off under this than without it, and I'm not sure that I understand how that has happened.
Sure. So it ultimately how a district sees its change with H.850 or with the old transition mechanism from Act 127 depends on the school district, right? Because tax rates depend on local ed spending per pupil. The Act 127 transition mechanism said, regardless of spending per pupil, assuming it's not going to go in front of the tax rate review board, which is a little bit more weedy, regardless of spending per pupil, the tax rate is capped at an increase of no more than 5%. So with the removal of the cap, then it says it's restoring the linear relationship of the education fund where the local education spending per pupil has a direct correspondence with that district's homestead property tax rate. So that means that the district rate will respond to its ed spending per pupil divided by the yield, which is how homestead property tax rates have been calculated for years. The cent discount is a further transition mechanism. So removing the 5% discount to restore the linearity and retain those flexible levers within the education fund, and then providing a cent discount for districts that saw a loss in tax capacity.
Okay, Andy.
We took away the excess spending cap, and I think for years, we didn't do it permanently. We pushed it out several years.
That's correct. So the excess spending threshold, which essentially says if a school district spends above a certain amount, then they have a higher tax rate for those dollars they're spending above that amount. That was first suspended during the COVID-19 years, and then Act 127 further suspended it through fiscal year 2029.
Through 29. And what was that rate? Or did it change every year?
The
excess spending rate.
the amount that would make a school district bump into the excess spending threshold, it changes by year. It's if inflationary adjusted based on average spending from a prior fiscal year. I don't remember off the top of my
But it
head.
just went up with inflation. There
Correct.
wasn't a more complicated.
Correct. The other piece of that is that it is written into statute as the spending per equalized pupil, which was the old way of calculating weighted pupils. So Act 127 did away with the equalization ratio. So starting in fiscal year 25, we no longer have equalized pupils.
Right. And so without getting into a policy position, do you feel that the lack of an excess spending penalty had any impact on the increases of the rate?
I think that's a great question that I can't speak to.
You won't answer. Right. Right. That prevented these very, very large increases because there would be a diminishing returns to do that. So it's interesting that we did that. Okay. Thank you.
We have about 4 more minutes.
The excess spending, again, not policy, just mechanics, was also one lever that the Agency of Education had to potentially review projects, because schools can, if they're doing construction, can actually apply to the agency to review their project for excess spending. We have a formula that we use to do that. And it also, does things like minimum and maximum square footage per specifications that go back to our prior construction program. So we also no longer have that lever. And we recently actually saw that when we were doing a review of the Woodstock project. They were coming to us because they have to get prior approval by law. But in terms of excess spending, that calculation actually mattered quite a bit. Yeah. And so that lever is, schools rarely come to us for excess spending approvals anymore, because why would they? But that was an oversight lever that we had.
Thank you. Any other questions while we have these fabulous women here with us? Okay. Oh, sorry, Mark. God, how could I not?
Julia, this is your second year, right? Third year. Okay. I'm amazed because as I listen, this is very complicated stuff, and I haven't heard a mistake in what you've said. And each thing that you have said, if you were sitting down with a smaller group, you could go into each of those areas in more detail. And there are a few people been around a long time that couldn't do that. So
that's a great compliment from Mark. I guess the last thing I'd like to ask is about income sensitivity and the cap on, is anyone contemplating a cap on income sensitivity increases, or are they just going to just go up as our homestead tax rate will? Because there have been caps in the past on income sensitivity. So curious about that.
1 minute, so I know I can't get very weedy.
You can have 2.
Okay, so with respect to if anyone's contemplating a cap, you probably know better than I do. I don't know. I will say that H 850 does have a provision that essentially says the tax department, if H 850 were to become law, the tax department would need to calculate a relative discount to income rates that the homestead cent discount is. So it does speak to that. I will note the second bullet point, which I didn't speak to because I thought it might get a little too weedy, or actually I didn't even end up including it. But essentially, property tax credits are on a lag, which means that the property tax credit that someone sees on their property tax bill corresponds with the prior year's property tax home income rate, and then even the prior year before that's income. So for that reason, on fiscal year 25 property tax bills, if you're an income sensitized payer, you'll see your FY25 homestead property tax rate minus your FY24 property tax credit. And that larger income sensitivity that's needed because if there were to be an increase in property tax bills in fiscal year 25, that larger property tax credit won't show up until fiscal year 26 property tax bills unless there is a policy decision to change that, just because of the mechanics of the property tax lag. It's quite weedy. I know it's a brain bender, but I think that the high level point is there's a lag. So property tax credits don't correspond with the year that they show up on the bill.
Right. I think with that, we say thank you, and further questions we can direct by email to Julia, Nicole, and Jill. And thank you all for your patience. This was great. This was really helpful as we go into town meeting week. So thank you very, very much. Good